Good evening. My name is Tracy Metz. I'm the director of the John Adams Institute. The John Adams is an emphatically independent cultural foundation that brings the best and the brightest of American thinking to the Netherlands. Welcome to this online event in collaboration with the Balie as part of their festival called the Night of Dictatorship. What a name for a festival, Tim.
Yes, it works, actually. Yeah.
We were very much hoping that this event this evening with our honored guest from Washington, D.C., David Frum, would be live, that he would be here in person. But as I'm sure you can all imagine, unfortunately, this plan was nixed by Corona. And so we're very happy that he's with us nevertheless from his home in Washington, D.C. Our moderator this evening is Tim Wagemakers, who is a programmer here at the Balie. And my role this evening will be to field your questions and to pass them on to our moderator, Tim, and our speaker, David Frum. You can send your questions in via the Slido site. You'll see the URL appearing regularly on your screen. So feel free to send in your questions. Don't wait. I can see them as they come in, and we'll try to pass on as many of them as we can to our speakers. David Frum wrote a book in 2018 called Trumpocracy. And he has recently published the sequel with at least as illuminating title, Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. There was an interesting, it was said that the first one was about the prediction and that this one now is about the assessment of this first, perhaps first, of two, who knows, presidency of Donald Trump. And I read a quote about it that I thought was very, that really stuck with me and that I wanted to share with you as sort of basis of this evening. Democracy is tested by its ability to deliver security, prosperity, and justice. And I think that gives us a set of important criteria by which to judge the past years of this administration. I would like to give the floor now to our moderator, Tim, and I will be back at the end of our session with some closing remarks. Tim.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks so much. A warm welcome, everyone. Nice that you're viewing this conversation with David Frum. As Tracy already said, he's the author of this amazing book, Trumpocalypse, which David, I'm just going to say it directly to you, really enjoyed reading. It's a really concise, good account of, I think, what's going on in America, but also the underlying trends and tendencies that have been shaping the forces that are now in play. Just to introduce him a bit further, he's a senior editor at The Atlantic. He knows his way around DC, not only because he's Zooming with us right from DC right now, but also because he worked, for example, as special assistant and speechwriter to President George W. Bush. Very warm welcome, David. Thanks for talking to us. I'd like to talk with you tonight about the presidential elections, of course, but also about how we got here, the future of the Republican Party. But maybe we should start with some recent developments. And we have a small clip about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away, and Donald Trump is in quite a rush to appoint a new Supreme Court judge. Let's look at the small clip, and then we can talk away from there. Let's watch it. As we see the clip.
The clock is ticking.
Yeah, I know it's moving along, but we have a lot of time. We have nothing but time, especially since we have the support. You know, we have senatorial support. People have come out, and I guess we have all the votes we're going to need. They're going to be very happy with the candidate. They know most of the candidates anyway. I think they know maybe all of the candidates. And we have great support from the people also.
Have you made a decision and you're just going to reveal it on Saturday? Or are you
I would
still
say that I'm very close to making a decision in my own mind, and I'm going to reveal it on Saturday. And I'm doing that out of respect for Justice Ginsburg.
Yeah, it's a really short clip, and your book is about restoring American democracy, and you say it's also about acting now to protect the country and restore it. Is this, with the Supreme Court appointment going on the way, such a defining moment right now we are in?
a real alarm about what could be. It is very possible that many important decisions about this very complicated election will end up at the Supreme Court. And President Trump wants to make sure that he has a favorable majority working on his behalf at the Supreme Court. So he is determined to cram through an appointment before the election. It's going to raise some important legitimacy concerns, because I think it's evident that if every legal citizen, if every legal vote were allowed to be cast in the United States, and if all of those votes were properly counted, that Donald Trump would lose the coming election. And again, in this hypothetical condition of fairness, the Republican Senate would also probably lose. And so people who are on pretty obviously on their way out of power under fair conditions are going to choose a decision maker who may allow them to keep power in an unfair way. That's, I think, going to be disturbing to a lot of people.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was quite old, but it's a really bad moment in that sense that really is a new force and shapes up a new dynamic in this election right now.
Yes. So this has been one of the major themes of the two books, Trumpocracy and Trumpocalypse, which is Donald Trump is an accelerant of existing problems in American life. I mean, it was true even without Donald Trump that the American system of government was working less well in the 21st century than it had worked in the 20th century. But Donald Trump is both a product of that deterioration of American democracy and an accelerant, pushing it to do worse things because he lacks any sense of shame. He lacks any feeling of consistency, and because he is so nakedly about his own because he's so naked about it. So he's pushed the system in new kinds of ways. A way to think about this is, in the United States, as in almost every democratic country, it is possible for the government to be elected with fewer votes than the opposition. In a system like the Netherlands, it must happen all the time, that parties, you're a multi-party proportional representation system, and no one finds it shocking that parties 2 and 3 might group together and form a coalition to exclude party 1. I'm sure that happens often. In a Westminster system, like Great Britain or Canada or Australia, again, in the last election in Canada in 2019, Justin Trudeau got fewer votes than his principal opponent, the leader of the Conservative Party. But he held the government anyway. But in a parliamentary system, this is not so much of a problem because the leader of the government is just that. I know, I grew up in Canada, I spent time there. It would be strange if a Canadian prime minister were to speak about the Canadian people. The Canadian prime minister is the leader of the government. There's also an opposition, and the leader of the opposition also represents the state just as much as the prime minister does. And I assume it's the same way in the Netherlands. Donald Trump claims to speak on behalf of the whole people and in a way that is more aggressive than most presidents do, even though he has been rejected by more people than supported him. And so he has pushed, and this is the thing I really want to impress on a foreign point. The reason we are in such crisis is he is pushing his party and his supporters to an explicit repudiation of the idea of majority rule, to an explicit repudiation of the idea that whoever gets the most votes should form the government. That we are now talking about in new kinds of ways that we really did not talk before Donald Trump.
Because actually, I said in my intro, you've worked for George W. Bush. He was one of the other presidents who did not win the popular vote, but still was installed president. But actually, what you're saying is, if a president, after that, working within that system, tries to unify and be a president for everyone, then you can say the system might not work as well as we want, but there's not a real problem. But if you're shameless about it and saying you represent the American people, then that is eroding the institution.
Well, I remember that election very well, and George Bush experienced it as a huge problem of legitimacy, that he failed to win the popular vote. Again, it was always theoretically possible, but in every election from the late 19th century until 2000, by coincidence, it had happened that the president who won the Electoral College also won the popular vote. When that didn't happen for George Bush, it was a problem. And I quote, I think, in Trumpocalypse, the speech President Bush gave in December of 2000, where he accepted the decision of the Supreme Court, but vowed, I will be a president for everybody. This is not a party event. He spoke about the need to earn the trust of the people who had voted against him. And people can have their views about George W. Bush, but he experienced this subjectively as something he had to do something about. And will say privately that personally, that I think one of the reasons that 9/11 had the impact on American society that it did, that surge of unity, was the country was looking for a way to come together behind a president that had come into office in a way that no president had done in 115 years. And so 9/11 in a way legitimated his presidency in a way that hadn't been before. But Donald Trump has never tried to do any of those things. And so we have, and his plan for re-election is again to use the defects, the antiquities of the American political system to claim to be president of the people, even as he loses by 3, 5, as many. It's quite possible he could lose by 10 million votes.
And he's not interested in winning the popular vote. He's interested in winning electoral college and becoming president again.
It's impossible for him. It is almost literally impossible for him to. Here's a way to think about this, just as a sense of where we're going. So in 2016, 133 million votes were cast. Now, if you sort of look at where we were in 2018, and the political scientists, I won't go through the logic, but the political scientists say it's very likely that 145 million votes will be attempted to be cast in 2020. If you average all the polls, Donald Trump gets about 42.5% of those 145 million votes, and Joe Biden will get about 50.5%. That, you do the arithmetic, that is a disparity, if all of that is correct, of 10 million votes. That is the margin of popular vote defeat that Donald Trump is looking at, and yet he will try to hold on to power all the same. That means you have to reject the democratic idea. It's just too flagrant otherwise.
But at the same time, you've described President Trump as a different kind of president. In your book, you call him a wartime president. And actually, maybe to get a bit more behind the elections, people frame these elections as the fight for the future of America, right? And you wrote also about this in your book, that it's an important moment for America to see where we're going. How would you summarize this fight to the core? I mean, we can't go through the entire book, but what's the essence of this fight that we are in with Trump as wartime president?
Well, when I called him a wartime president, I was actually borrowing a phrase from an Atlantic colleague of mine, Ron Brownstein, who said that Donald Trump is a wartime president in a war that rural America is fighting against urban America. He's the president of, or as I say, this is my phrase, that he is the president of the white population of the red states of America. He has never tried to be president of all of the United States of America. I think one of the ways to think about this, especially from the vantage point of Amsterdam, is to say that politics across the developed world has these days a lot more in common than it does differently. Everywhere, we are dealing with similar kinds of stresses. We're dealing with the failure of market economies to deliver the results that they delivered in the 30 and 40 years after World War II. We're dealing with the stresses of globalization, especially mass migration. We're dealing with the rise of economic competition from China and India. And so we see just about everywhere, in every democratic system, that we are seeing the decline of the old divide between parties of the left and right, social democrats versus, as you would call them, liberal, as we would call them, conservative parties, in favor of a new politics of identity, where you have these authoritarian nationalist groupings, and they have much more in common. And I talk in the book about how strange it is to call them nationalist when they're actually so internationalist. That social democratic parties are now quite different country to country. But from Poland to Italy to Donald Trump is a cultural hero. The mask is a cultural symbol. For the people on the left-hand side, the mask is just a medical device that either works or not. And you listen to the experts and they say, here's what the mask can do, and here's what it can't do. And it doesn't have moral meaning. It's just an object that does a certain job more or less well. But for people on this other side, the mask is a powerful symbol, and it's so similar across country to country.
But so if you talk about concepts of identity, if you talk about this cultural hero, then you wrote your book. It starts with, I'm writing this in March, and at the beginning of COVID. But we've seen some really urgent developments in America. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen, well, you actually mentioned it in your previous answer already, the whole thing about the masks, whether or not to wear them. Would you say that this is an extension or another example of what you've been describing in your book, or has you've also gained new insights about this fight that we're talking about?
Well, I keep saying about the Trump presidency that while there are many secrets, there are no mysteries. That we have the essential logic of it has always been there, and it's very similar to things you see in France and Germany and in your own country. And what we're arguing about is whether the democratic mixed economy consensus that we took out of the ruins of World War II, the sense that we all are in this together, that we need international institutions to keep the peace. In fact, that keeping the peace is the supreme goal of political leadership. Maybe it's just the passing of time, but those things seem increasingly unreal. And that you can have in Donald Trump a president who rejects NATO, who rejects the post-war trading system, and you see people like that across the continent of Europe. And I often feel that this is something where the divide may be between those who remember and those who don't, who know what we have overcome, what we have accomplished, and those who no longer care.
Yeah, but at the same time, you could maybe also say, or some people say, Trump is the last shrug of a sort of old world. And millennials vote differently right now. The demography of the country is becoming more diverse every day. The new America is being made already, but it's just not coming from the White House.
Well, there was a book published in, I think, about 2002 called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And it gained a lot of influence because I think one of the things that one of the last trace elements of Marxism on people on the left is a belief in automatic historical processes. That society develops in a certain way, society develops and politics must follow. And I think when you actually say out loud this idea, I just saw you smile. You say, well, that's obviously not true. But the habit of thinking that way is, I think, very deep on people on the left-hand side of the spectrum, even if they mark the Marx habit, even if they reject the Marx ideology. And I think in all of our countries, we're going to see we have choices to make. And so one of the things I'm asked a lot about is to make predictions. And I always refuse to do this because the people who make predictions treat the future as a thing that exists, a thing about which comments can be made. And they do not see that the future is something we are making together right now. And in fact, events like this, we are choosing a future one way or the other. And it could be radically different depending on what people do.
Yeah. We're talking, and then I'm sure there are many questions coming in from Slido. Maybe one thing to touch upon is when we're talking about re-election, actually one of the things you say in your book is, even if Trump is not re-elected, still the damage is being done, and his legacy is something. Actually, I quote you because I think it's better in your words. To contain and reverse the global movement to illiberal authoritarianism, it will be necessary to do more, much more, than eject that movement's mouthpiece president from the Oval Office.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, there's. We were talking just a moment ago about the dynamic nature of politics, how politics is about choices. And so if Donald Trump loses, first, the people who supported him and who they remain. And the weaknesses in the American political system that he exploited, they remain. And the adverse trends in the world economy, they all remain. I mean, we are moving to a world in which many people are losing faith in the ideas of trade and integration. On the European continent, you can see many people becoming impatient with the European project and seeing it as tedious and boring and not. The poetry is all with those who would destroy, not with those who want to build and create. And so we are going to, if we get through 2020 on the two sides of the Atlantic together, that the job of restoring partnerships, restoring trading arrangements, making people understand that democracy is exciting and ennobling. And I think one of the things we saw in movements like, what we see in movements like the Black Lives Matter movement and the Bernie Sanders movement is they're kind of impatient with meetings. That they think politics is something that happens in the streets. It happens on your feet. It happens to the accompaniment of music. And the idea that, no, it happens in a committee room. It happens by raising your hand and speaking in turn, that is politics. When the first book came out, and it was right now we're kind of in a cynical and tired mood in the United States. When the first book came out, we were in a much more energized mood. And so I spoke to a lot of very idealistic young people who at different campuses who would ask me, what could they personally do to make a difference? And my advice to them always was, get involved in something political that seems boring. Go to get involved with a group that decides whether or not liquor licenses can go till in your neighborhood can be extended till 2 a.m. or they must stop at midnight. Serve on a jury. Anything where you must work with people who are different from yourself toward a limited goal, and where you develop the habits of political cooperation. And what you see in these mass, and I think we all have some sympathy with the ultimate goals of Black Lives Matter, but what we see is a movement that increasingly is a movement and not a political activity at all. And the energies of movements are, for democratic societies to channel them in productive ways is always very difficult, and it requires habits that we value less than people did 30 and 40 years ago.
But at the same time, that's also a second step, right? After raising awareness, getting involved, the things people are fighting for drip into politics and other people start taking it over. It's also a natural process, maybe.
Yes and no. If you are prepared to accept, I will not get my own way. If you say that getting some of what I want is good, it's unreasonable. That
learning to appreciate compromise.
Unless that if I do not get everything, it's a betrayal. That's why revolutionary movements so often end up at the guillotine, because they know only there are only two possibilities: the total creation of a new society, or betrayal from within. And since they never create a new society, there must always be betrayal from within.
It's a good moment, maybe, if we're at the guillotine right now, to go to Slido and see what questions are popping in. Tracy, do you have a few?
I have a lot, and thank you all for sending them in. A lot of really good questions. One of them that I think connects well with this part of our discussion: if Biden is elected, what should his first priority be to reinvigorate American democracy?
I think his first priorities have to be to deal with the choke points in the American political system that will enable a minority to doom him to failure. Because politics will continue. And if we have a weak recovery from coronavirus, if the problems if there isn't quick improvement, there's an election in 2022, and that isn't enough time for the Republican Party to be reconciled to democratic values. So Biden needs to do things to make sure that he's able to realize a meaningful program. And some of that will be at the federal level, reforms to Congress. I would say making sure that there's some urban states like the District of Columbia, getting statehood quickly for the District of Columbia. A lot of them happen at the local level, because one of the ways that 2020 will be very different from 2008, and it will give an opportunity that wasn't there in 2008, is 2020 is also a census year, which means that 2021 will be a redistricting year. What happened to President Obama So he wins in 2008, he becomes president in 2009. He does not deliver results very quickly. And so he loses seats in 2010, and then the Republicans who gain seats and who achieve at the state level a dominance they have not had since the 1920s, then proceed to rewrite all of the maps in a way that gives them through the 2010s massive power at the state level. In the 2018 election, Republicans got about 45% of the vote in the state of Wisconsin, and they got about 65% of the seats. And they owe that success to the maps they drew back in 2011. Democrats are going to have an opportunity, if they win at the state level in 2020, to draw less gerrymandered maps in 2021 and to create a more competitive political system. I say this, I remain a registered Republican, and I look forward to the day I can return to working within my natural political party. But we need the Democrats to be successful in this project, because we need Republicans to be forced to confront. They must be a party of the Democratic center-right. They must seek power by competing for votes, not seek power by preventing people from voting.
Tracy, another question?
One of the questions that, if I may steal the mic in this case, one of the questions I really wanted to ask you myself, David, was what does it mean to you now to be a Republican in a time when, in the eyes of many, the Republican Party has gone over to the dark side?
Well, without being overdramatic about this comparison, I think there have been many moments where a political system emerges from authoritarianism that let me answer it with another question. What does it mean to be on the left in Eastern Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall? What does it mean to be on the right in Chile after the departure of Pinochet? That is, that you had these authoritarian leaders who hijacked your values for their own purposes. And you have to find some way to rehabilitate your values while repudiating authoritarian methods. And it's challenging. I mean, it has been challenging for the German left to, especially in the eastern part of Germany, to make its peace fully with the German Republic, and it's been challenging for the Chilean right to do the same. I think that's sort of what it means. I mean, I am a believer in markets. I'm a believer in private property. I'm sympathetic to the problems of business enterprise. I want to see generally a smaller state sector rather than a bigger state sector. I want to see. I'm prepared to trade. At any given moment, given the choice between more liberty and more equality, I make the more liberty choice. The things that push you toward the right, as we call it in the modern world, that's where I am. But I'm also a small d Democrat, and I'm in that broad sense of the term. I'm forced to confront. I'm someone who believes in the broadest idea of what it means to be a liberal. That is to be in favor of the free competition of ideas and the use of force in politics. So we have a Republican Party that needs to be redeemed and made a useful institution again, rather than a dangerous one.
I think that's something we're going to dive into also a bit later. Maybe one more question from Slido. Do you have one?
Yes, this connects with what you were just saying, David. One of our audience members asked whether the Republican Party can be salvaged without denouncing the Trump administration.
Well, it's going to have to be salvaged, because so long as we have the political institutions we do, the United States will be a two-party system. And it's so hard to launch a new political party in the United States. I mean, we have seen parties go through events that would seem even more discrediting than Donald Trump. I say in the book that the Democrats got themselves on the wrong side of the Civil War. The Republicans got themselves on the wrong side of the Great Depression. And both parties managed to come back because it's easier to change them than to start new. I think it won't happen that the process of coming to terms with Donald Trump will happen through generational change. That people who were not present will say, we'll get younger people, and they will say, well, obviously I wanted nothing to do with that, but I still believe in these principles, and that's how reform will, I hope, come. We need it to happen fast, because it's going to be a bumpy ride in the next 2 to 4 years post-COVID. And if we have a party that remains Trumpified, being one of our two great parties in the United States, we will never achieve democratic stability.
but that maybe also demands some courage or some, how do you say it? There is this moment right now, also you see that with the nomination of a new Supreme Court judge, that you can take the risk of walking along a long way with Trump, hoping he doesn't get re-elected, but you still get a favorable Supreme Court in that sense. So you gamble a bit on getting both if you are a Republican. How do you move away from that gamble? Because it requires some long-term planning, some long-term vision about where you want to end up as a Republican Party and what you think is more important, sealing the deal right now or working towards a durable vision.
Well, American parties can't work that. We don't have a central committee. There's no central brain. There's no leadership. In the first decade of the 21st century, the British Conservatives had lost a lot of elections during the Tony Blair era, and then about 6 people met in the living room of David Cameron and decided we need to rethink what it means to be a conservative, and they were able to do it because if 6 people was enough. That's not how it ever works in American. I make it up. I don't know. There was literally 6 people, but it was a handful of people. That's not how it works here, and it will work through.
Well, there were attempts, right? I mean, when Mitt Romney. When Mitt Romney lost to Obama, there was a report made. I think it's called the autopsy, or people called it, and it said the GOP should expand its outreach to communities of color, women, young voters. So there were agendas being made, but is there still someone pushing that forward?
No one now. But what will happen is, and this is how the process of regeneration could happen. If the 2020 election is bad enough for Republicans, not only at the national level but at the state level, if the gerrymanders of the 2010s are corrected in the 2000s and 20s, and Republicans realize a lot of things that they and we care about are in danger unless they find ways to be competitive. That's how change comes, and it will start, I think, more at the state level. The thing I worry about is the California example, which is California has not been a competitive two-party state really for 15 years. So you would think that there would be ambitious political entrepreneurs, and California has lots of problems. So you would say that there'd be ambitious who would say, there are homeless people on the street, and no one will do anything about it. That the state has these terrible unfunded pension liabilities to its public sector workers. No one will do anything. And some political entrepreneur will say, everybody wants to be the Democratic candidate for governor. Nobody wants to be the Republican candidate for governor. I will choose the weaker party and build a career that way. But that is, strangely enough, has not happened. And the California party has responded to 15 years of failure by becoming ever more extreme and failing ever worse. So that's the trap that you can get into if you're not careful.
I think some people want to dive a little bit deeper into something you mentioned, Tracy.
We have quite a few questions from people who wonder, is the US on the brink of civil war? Will states secede from the Union? And what is the worst case scenario if Trump is reelected or claims the election?
I share the view that we live in a much more peaceful world than people did even 30 years ago. So I think I don't envision these kinds of very dramatic, very violent scenarios. But I do worry about, and I think we are seeing this, the risk of low intensity right-wing racialist violence. And I have a chapter in the book about this. The attack on the Christchurch, New Zealand mosque, Anders Breivik, the attacks we've seen in the United States. So this is not a civil war, because we're talking about, the most terrible of these killers will kill some dozens of people, which is hard. That's hardly, it's a horrifying catastrophe, but it's not a battle. Because we don't do that anymore. But I worry about that just as disturbed young men from Islamic backgrounds can go on the internet and find a starter kit of rationalizations and methods and slogans and ideology, And then the starter kit says, now go find your own weapon and go find your own target. There's no training, there's no program, there's no organization, but there is a kind of prefabricated tissue of ideas and grievances and justifications. And I think we're seeing now on both sides of the Atlantic, young men from traditional, ethnic majority backgrounds self-radicalizing in that same ISIS way. And in our country, where it's so easy to get weapons, if you can find a rationalization and a grievance, you can find a weapon, and then you can find a target.
You wrote about this
today. That we'll see a lot of this.
You mentioned this today on Twitter, David. You're an active Twitterer, and I enjoy reading your tweets. And you said there was a video of a group of armed men walking the streets. And you said this is not militia, this is simply a gang.
Right.
So that
we have
seems to indicate a serious lawlessness.
Where we will see men in scraps and fragments of military uniform carrying weapons and trying to intimidate their neighbors, and they will often be described as part of a militia movement. Well, a militia in America is an old established institution in the United States. It is the armed force of a state government, and what makes something a militia, we have the first federal act describing the militia was passed in 1792. And it regulated the relationship between the federal government and the militias, and it identified two crucial elements to make something a militia. There must be officers who have control over their troops, and those officers must in turn answer to a political authority. And if you have those two conditions, the officers discipline the troops, and the officers answer, then it's a militia. It's distinguished from the regular armed forces because it's less professional. They're maybe not paid, they maybe don't drill all the time. But these people, they are gangs, and this is an increasingly common phenomenon in the United States, and many of the individuals in those gangs will, again, find their way to prefabricated rationalizations for violence on the internet. Once Trump is gone, I do worry about this as a problem.
But then maybe that was another segment I thought would be interesting to talk about, and that's maybe, and you write in your book also about it, how did we get here? I mean, and one of the things in your book, I thought it was a really striking sentence. You write about some conservative presidents, you write, sometimes they have drawn power from deep and dark energies in the American soul. And you say that in response to some people claiming in the book racism and authoritarianism were always present within American conservatism. Is it in that sense that what's happening right now and what we're seeing is a legacy also of the presidents that came before him, and also a president maybe you served? Is there some truth to that?
Well,
because I thought it was really a deep sentence that they have drawn from these deep and dark energies.
But I think I go on to say in that same paragraph that while they drew from these energies, they also tried to control the energies. And the difference between a Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or I'll tell a story about President Bush. I remember being in a conversation with him with a staffer, and one of our staffers, who's a very sophisticated, modern person, and went on to a very successful career, but his father was kind of an oddball who lived in the hills with that. And President Bush was very funny. He asked this staffer, "So your dad, does he have his own generator? Does he keep stock up on canned goods?" And he completely knew the type, but he obviously thought of it as that's not one of my supporters. I have zero time for that. But I would say we have to do two things. We have to keep two truths in mind. And Americans tend to say, they explain everything in American society by reference to something else in American society. So they say, we see Donald Trump, and therefore we will look backwards into the American past and look at Reagan and George W. Bush and Richard Nixon. And I'm always trying to press Americans to be less parochial in their political thinking and say, okay, yes, I'm not telling you you're completely wrong, that this has historical continuity, but it is notable that there are similar movements in Poland, in Hungary, in Eastern Germany, in France, in Great Britain. They are not drawing from the history of the Republican Party. So I encourage you to look across borders and look laterally at the experiences of many different advanced countries whose politics are so similar to one another, and emphasize that more. And that the uniqueness of the American experience emphasize it less, because I think with these authoritarian nationalist movements, we are all very much in the same boat.
Yeah.
And I think that the solution to these problems is going to, we're all in the same boat too, because it's going to require more international cooperation, both at the basic level of police work. We have to make sure that, the man who shot up the mosque was an Australian-born person who did his weapons training in Europe and then decided to carry out his murder in New Zealand because he found the police there less sophisticated than in Australia. And that these people are moving across borders, so the police have to work across borders. And at the same time, if we're going to get our economies moving again post-COVID, we are going to need more trade and more international organization. I mean, it is a horrible thing to me that in this COVID crisis, you've seen even in Europe a breakdown of cooperation when you had borders rise and France and Germany refused to share medical supplies with Italy, never mind the absence of cooperation between the United States and the European Union and the British off on their own adventure. And that what we ought to have learned from the past, from this experience, if we didn't know it already, was this world's problems are too big for any one government, even the government of the United States.
But maybe because I think that's a really excellent analysis of not emphasizing America's uniqueness all the time to explain things that are going on in the entire world. At the same time, we've all seen that America in the past decades was such an important world power, maybe world leader, that of course they were also in a situation to spread certain, how do you say it? What's happening in America also affects other countries. So at the same time, you can also say that, for example, if you talk about free markets, if you talk about trade, for decades that was shaped by American stance towards that.
Well, that's going to have to change. I mean, when I was in the Bush administration, as you mentioned, and that was not even now, that's not quite 20 years ago. Depending on who's doing the math, the American economy then was about 7 times the size of the Chinese economy. When we went into the last global financial crisis in 2008, the American economy was 3 times the size of the Chinese economy. Today, depending on who's counting, the Chinese economy is about 3/4 the size of the United States, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. And before I'm able to finish probably my last book, the Chinese economy will overtake the United States economy, sometime perhaps as soon as this coming decade. So we no longer live in a world in which the United States, now the United States will remain the richest country, or the American side will remain richer than China, but the idea that the United States will be able to impose its will on the world, and that's one of the ways that Donald Trump is such a backward-looking figure, because his big idea has been he will bark orders and everybody else will obey. And he didn't understand when America could bark orders like that, the presidents were wise enough not to try. Maybe one of the reasons we have Donald Trump is because we are realizing we've lost our power to bark orders, and so we got a barker at exactly the moment when the barker became most obsolete.
But that's like the emperor without any clothes on, right?
Yeah, I think or maybe like when you said emperor, maybe like the way that as the Roman Empire got weaker, the Roman emperors had ever more elaborate etiquette. When they were all powerful, they were simple people who dressed like anybody else. When as their empire deteriorated, they insisted they would wear these absurd costumes. I just think if we're going to have a world of trade and democratic agreement, we are going to have partnership and alliances, and we're going to need American leadership is going to have to be self-conscious about the need for cooperation in a way that Donald Trump defies.
Tracy, are there any other questions?
Yes, absolutely. You were addressing the relative strength of the Chinese economy. There have been several questions about the role of Russia in this election. And one of our audience members who sent in a question is worried that Biden, if he wins, will retaliate against Russia and that might start another world war. Can you address the issue of Russia's role in these elections?
Russia had, I think, an important and maybe even decisive role in 2016. I think in 2020, they're likely to be less effective. The most important thing that they did in 2016 was to contribute to the deterioration in African American turnout. The Russians, their most sophisticated propaganda message are messages aimed at stoking the disillusionment and alienation of younger black voters, especially younger black men. The system is rigged. It's all hopeless. You should stay home. And so we saw black turnout has been rising in every election since the 1960s. Obviously, because of the Obama election, that drove a historic spike in black voter turnout, and it reached an all-time. It reached what everyone thought was a peak in 2008, and then in 2012, it rose even higher than in 2008. That's one of the reasons that Mitt Romney was surprised by the election, that his model was based on, well, 2008, that's a record for black turnout. It can't be any higher than that in 2012.
But it turned out it
President
was.
Obama is deteriorating on every other group in the population. You just do the arithmetic. He's not being disrespectful, but you just do the arithmetic. He can't win. Except black America turned out in even greater numbers in 2012 than in 2008. In fact, 2012 was the first election in American history where a black person was more likely to come vote than a white person was. So obviously there was going to be some relaxation from that in 2016. But the decline was much bigger than you would. It fell not only it fell back below 2008 levels, and it fell furthest in the Midwest, and it fell furthest of the states in which it fell deepest were Wisconsin and Michigan. And if black turnout in those two states had been anything like its historic norm, Hillary Clinton would have won Michigan by 1 million votes at least. So the Russians were important there. But this point about, look, this is a piece of junk from RT and Sputnik. The Russians are always saying, if we don't get our way, if you say we can't use poison gas, that's it, World War III. And you think, you know what? Russia is a society with an economy the size of Italy, with a military less capable than Israel's. You know, if you just tell them the rules, they're going to have to listen. There are a lot of policy outcomes other than they get to do whatever they want in World War III.
So next question, maybe.
There have been also several questions about the U.S. election system. Is it possible to finally make the move away from the Electoral College and towards a majority vote?
Well, I think we should be doing in the 2020s at the state level some experiments. I mean, there is a project, for example, at some states to experiment with ranked choice voting. I would be interested to see how that comes out. I mean, we do have these laboratories of democracy where we need to try things. And one of the advantages of the federal system is you get to experiment with ideas at the state level, see if they produce positive results, and then if they work, adopt those ideas nationally. It's hard to see how you get rid of the Electoral College.
That would mean changing the Constitution.
Right, but there are ways you can mitigate the Electoral College. For example, electoral votes are distributed according to the total number of congressional seats plus the 2 Senate seats. So California, I think, is 56 votes, something has got 54. So if we were to make, for example, the House of Representatives bigger, and if we were to say instead of 435 in the House of Representatives, we went to 635, we would right the balance. We would, just by doing that, we would shrink the power of some of the less populated states. And remember, the real evil of the Electoral College is it's bad that it favors the underpopulated states, but the real evil is the way it tends to make to nullify the votes of people who live in states that are politically one-sided. So a state like California, which now votes 2-to-1 Democratic, neither Republicans nor Democrats put much effort into California, because why should they? Because the outcome is preordained, whereas they put a lot of effort into Florida, which is a big state, but which is a closely divided one. So we need to think about how we make our elections more contested. But the reforms I am most immediately interested in are making the District of Columbia state to bring a more urban quality into the Senate. You'd probably get 2 senators of color, bang, right away from that, and to make the Senate work more effectively. But expanding the House could go far to weakening the ill effects of the Electoral College.
But also you're right to adopt a Modern Voting Rights Act.
Yes. Well, so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 which is still in effect, but its most important provision was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. And what the Supreme Court did, what they said in 2013 was not crazy, by the way. The Supreme Court said, the Voting Rights Act said, those states and cities that have histories, that have pre-1965 histories of racial discrimination, they get special scrutiny from the Department of Justice. What that meant in 2013 was that the state of Hawaii, which had a history of racial privilege in voting, that got special scrutiny. And the state of Wisconsin, which is the worst actor north of the Mason-Dixon line, it didn't get special scrutiny. Yeah. And the Supreme Court said that's irrational. And the Supreme Court, I think, was right about that. So I think a modern Voting Rights Act has to begin by saying the problem with the measures that were struck down in 2013 was they gave special scrutiny according to your behavior in the years before 1965. So a modern Voting Rights Act is one that says we need to look at, we are going to need to look at, have some system of review that is not based on history, but is based on current practice. Yeah. To say, are there, are you gerrymandering? Do you consistently make it more difficult to have voting in poorer neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods than a majority? You need some kind of objective tests based in the here and now that would trigger action by the Department of Justice, not the history lesson that was struck down in 2013.
Yeah. Because actually that's another theme I'd like to address, maybe, because you're talking, if I listen to you, you say it's no use to speculate about the future. I don't do predictions. We should be careful with looking back and saying this is where it all started, since this uniqueness of America, where we're seeing global trends. So we need to look at right now. And one of the things, if you talk about the institution, is journalism, right? And actually today, Ilko Bos van Rosenthal, who's a friend of the John Adams Institute, journalist, he wrote a piece about how American journalism is, well, in trouble, since they don't know how to deal with this president. And one of the things that some people said was you should stop covering America as a democracy. Because if you do that, you do the wrong things. You cover every press conference, you cover everything the president says, because in general essence, you think government are in good faith. What you should do is, you should cater everything as a sandwich, say the disclaimer, he's probably not true, Trump said this, and doctors disputed that. How do you see this role of journalism? Because it was quite a telling piece, I think, how this discussion is going on in America.
We have no BBC, and even our most powerful elite institutions, like the New York Times, have very limited range, very limited reach compared to their counterparts in Europe. The beginning of wisdom about journalism in the United States is to understand that the most important media companies in the United States are not the New York Times, not CNN, not even Fox News. The most important media company in the United States, by far, is Facebook. And the next most important media company in the United States is YouTube. Probably Reddit is somewhere up there. And a podcaster named Joe Rogan is more important than CNN. And just so when we talk about being in the now, we need to, and so much of our media criticism is based on the media habits of older, better educated, more affluent people who grew up in a different media culture than the one of today. So I don't think the problem is that cable, there's much to criticize in the way cable news covers anything. CNN in particular, we all consume it, and it has the problem. CNN is both simultaneously trying to be moderate in its positioning, but super sensationalist in its method. Actually, it is of the networks, it is by far it is more sensational than Fox News. You will find more because CNN depends so much on keeping you watching for 2 more minutes.
And Fox doesn't.
Not as much, because Fox is, this is maybe more, but Fox tends to be in, if you get the cheapest cable package, you get CNN. You have to pay a little bit more to get the package that has Fox, typically, not in every town, but we do this by different regions, but typically, so Fox, if your cable company buys Fox and you take the second package, whether you ever watch Fox or not, they get $2 a year from you.
Yeah.
They don't really need to keep you watching. They worry about their regular watchers and selling advertising. But CNN is in a different business. So they depend enormously on their airport travel. They just need to get eyeballs. And so they tend to be the most, and if you watch them, you will see that they're always saying, coming up, the boy trapped in the well. We'll have the story about the boy trapped in the well at the 55-minute mark, but they don't tell you what's going, like just in this desperate effort to keep you moving. But for all of that, it's not as important at all as the way that Facebook manipulates those who are less sophisticated. I mean, the fact is that people who are watching cable news are by far the best informed people, by far the most politically mobilized, most attached to the political system. If they are absorbing, if their cable news package is biased, it's because the consumer wants that bias, understands the bias, is paying money for the bias or giving time. Facebook is engaged in a much more, is dealing with people are much more disconnected, and their disinformation. And it's not just political, by the way. The Facebook. If you were to say, what is the single most important consequence of the existence of Facebook? It's the return of measles and other preventable diseases. Because in 1995, if you were an anti-vaxxer, you didn't know anyone who didn't think you were crazy. Whereas in 2020, if you're an anti-vaxxer, you can build a community of people who think you're not crazy.
But actually, that's also something you write about in your book, because you get this sort of new, strange, interesting coalitions that sort of break through the boundaries we used to set for ourselves from Democrats, Republicans, left, right. It's a whole different kind of forces that are up there, right?
Well, you see this in the reaction to the pandemic. And I have this question in the book is, we have the people who are opposed to modern medicine, who doubt science on the pandemic. Are they left-wing or right-wing? I assume, and it's true in the Netherlands as here, that when you meet these people, they have this. Many of them have patterns that look right, or backgrounds that look right wing. Others have backgrounds that look left wing. But in this new world, what they agree about is that the pandemic is a fake. That Bill Gates wants to put a microchip in your body. In the same way, I mean, we've had a revival of conspiratorial anti-Semitism. Is that left wing or is that right wing? It appeals to people on both sides. And meanwhile, in the era of Trump and Brexit, you discover like John Major and Tony Blair. What do they disagree about? I mean, once upon a time, they're the deepest political enemies. And today, probably on the most important issues facing Great Britain, John Major and Tony Blair probably agree about everything.
Yeah. So our way of analysis has also to change, maybe. Yeah. There are different questions, I guess, again.
There are indeed. A number of people are wondering, we saw again today that Trump refuses to say whether he'll accept the outcome of the elections. Roger Stone has said, you should declare martial law right away.
Right.
What could possibly happen if he does indeed not accept the outcome? Constitutional limbo, martial law? What are the scenarios?
Yeah. Well, with Donald Trump, there's always the combination of his political pathology and his psychological pathology. So what you're hearing when he talks about not accept, it's also he cannot psychically cope with not being the dominant, all-powerful winner. So he doesn't have a plan B. President Obama, going into the 2012 election, ordered a part of his administration to focus on should he lose, a transition plan to Mitt Romney. And that there was a group of people whose job it was to prepare for the possibility that President Obama would lose and would have to transition power. Because the way a psychologically normal politician thinks is, I hope I win, I believe I deserve to win, I think I probably will win, but nothing in life is certain, and you have to be prepared for every eventuality, and I don't want to look, and if I lose, I don't want to look irresponsible and selfish and like I only cared about me and not the country. So Donald Trump doesn't have that. But he's also he depends on emotion, this dark emotional energy, so he's trying to stoke it because he knows that his people are intimidating, that they are the people who go to polling stations with guns and stand, and we saw some of this in 2016, and we'll see more of it in 2020, stand with guns and try to frighten away women who are coming with children and maybe deter them from voting, or create a general mood of uncertainty and chaos that will allow Donald Trump to hold on to power in some way. I don't know. I don't think he's got a plan. He never has plans, but he's got habits and impulses. And if the vote is close, I think we could be into some very dangerous situations. We could also see a part of the country decide that even if Biden wins and takes the oath and assumes power, that somehow that they are no longer connected. The whole system is no longer legitimate. And so, we had this, in the 15 years after the Civil War, the people in the Western movies, the Jesse James and Billy the Kid and people like that, they were veterans of the Confederate Army. Yeah. Who would go far, who decided the government had no standing in their eyes. And so they moved out beyond the reach of society, and they then attacked train. They were both political terrorists and bandits. And that's a common pattern, right? You rob the train to disrupt the US mail because you hate the United States. And you also make a dishonest dollar for yourself at the same time. And we may see some of that. And Donald Trump is sort of preparing the way for that.
But at the same time, if that happens, then you say he might not win the popular vote, but we have the risk, and that was quite a harsh sentence, we have a risk of losing the connection of the people who voted for him to the political system in America.
Yes.
If you say that, then it sounds to me, as a total nitwit on the subject, it sounds to me as if that's maybe even a bigger risk or even more worse than him becoming president again. It sounds like a catch-22.
No, well, look, we have to solve one problem at a time.
Okay.
And it's like that game Jenga where you have to take away the sticks, or like in the James Bond movie. Me too. Okay, in the James Bond movie where they have to cut one wire after another to defuse the bomb. You can't cut all the wires at once. It's one at a time, and then the expertise is knowing which wire is the one to cut last.
Yeah.
But so bringing about a more normal government, that's task one. But then we have to find some way. I mean, 63 million people voted for Donald Trump, and they're not moving anywhere. And while they are getting older, they are going to be with us for some time. And we have to find some way to reconcile as many of them as possible.
What would be the first step?
That's the last third of the book. I think we need to, first, the first step is to make sure, the most important step is to make sure the government works better for people. I mean, one of the reasons that Americans are so alienated from government is they don't see results for them. So I talk in the book about a series of projects that I think could bind the citizens closer to the government, and some come from what we would conventionally call the left-hand side, and some come from what we call the right-hand side. So I'm very impressed by the way that people in other countries feel bound to their state by their health insurance system. That what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be Canadian? That the health insurance system is an important part of that self-definition. No American would talk that way. But people, the famous line of John F. Kennedy, ask what you can do for your country. I think we need to do a little bit of asking now of what the country can do for people. So if people felt, well, what does it mean to be an American? Well, among other things, it means I get this card. That means if I get sick, somebody takes care of me. That's what it means to be British. That's what it means to be Canadian. I think that's what it means to be Dutch.
And it should be what it means to be American.
I get some concrete material benefits that other people don't get, not because I'm better and they're worse. I don't think Dutch people think they're better because only Dutch people get the benefits of the Dutch health system and Belgians don't. It just means that's what it means to belong to this political community. But at the same time, I think we have to reinforce our political community by having less mass migration. And those two things, that the health provision, more health provision and less immigration go together. But we have to look at a series of things to bind the people more closely to the state and to give them a feeling of ownership and responsibility and protectiveness, and to see the state as something that works for them, not against them.
Tracy.
Looking forward to a possible outcome of the election where Biden is chosen, one of our audience members says he has quite a diverse base, going from Bernie Bros to the Lincoln Project. Can this coalition hold together if he is indeed elected?
If it doesn't, that's partly good news. That is, if we have a rapid return to a more normal Republican Party, then a lot of the Lincoln Project, I think, when you talk about that, I don't know if that name means anything to a Dutch audience, but the Lincoln Project is a group of disaffected Republicans who created some very clever ads. But the secret, one of the important parts of Biden's success is that he's not just winning these few Republican activists, but that millions of Republican leaners in suburbs voted Democrat in 2018 and will vote for him in 2020. Those people may drift away. That wouldn't be a bad thing. It would mean that we're having more normal two-party competition again.
Yeah. Maybe if we're going to round it off a little bit, maybe there are some questions. We can look at one ad from the Lincoln Project, because if we're talking about things that are happening right now in the coming weeks, the videos by the Lincoln Project are quite, it's the third video, Victor, are quite, well, they come from the Never Trump campaign in the Republican Party, right? They come from many Republicans. And actually, they sometimes are better at showing a big stance than some Democratic videos, I would say. Can we see it, Victor?
Losers. Suckers. Dopes. Babies. That's how Donald Trump describes our men and women in uniform. Even Fox News confirms he said it. An American president would know our troops are defined by words like courage, honor, integrity, strength, patriotism, valor, and for so many, sacrifice. He's a draft dodger-in-chief who despises the men and women he supposedly leads. He insults their deaths and injuries with his contempt. He looks down on them for serving this nation, mocking them because there's no money in it. Millions of Americans have served and sacrificed. Millions more have sent a family member off to war. Only Donald Trump mocks their deaths, because Donald Trump is simply un-American.
The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
I think you can say it's quite a harsh commercial, and it does something that maybe to see what choices can we make in the coming weeks, what's going on. It's like trying to pay him back on his own ground by saying he's talking about Make America Great Again, about patriotism, and the way to confront him is by showing that he's un-American. What do you think of that? Because you search for a way to get the country back together, to get communities connected to each other, and at the same time the responses to Trump, well, you can say it's also polarizing in a sense.
Well, for the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, you would often hear pro-Trump defenders say, Never Trump is not a political party, it's a dinner party. It was a mean joke. And then in 2018, the Democrats took the House of Representatives. And the way they took it was not because of the famous Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her seat was Democratic before. Not Ilhan Omar. Her seat was Democratic before. The seats that were not Democratic before were seats like the 7th District of Texas. Now, this is a seat that George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush, won in 1966. And it stayed Republican through Watergate, through the Iraq War, through the financial crisis, and it went Democratic in 2018. Newt Gingrich's former seat in suburban Atlanta, it went Democratic in 2018. And you go through seat after seat in wealthy or affluent suburbs that normally are Republican, and they went Democratic, with, by the way, the winners often being, or almost always being, women. And that's Donald Trump's risk, is that when you look at the groups he's losing, the most dangerous group to him he's been losing Republican-leaning, college-educated women. And they are the people who threatened his hold on Florida. They are the people who threatened his hold on Arizona. And so the Lincoln Project, I think to formulate it as this group of consultants is to see something wrong. Is to understand that what is happening here is that millions of people who voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 and voted for John McCain or George Bush in 2004 are moving away from Donald Trump.
Yeah. Maybe a last question to top it off, because your profession used to be speechwriter, right? Yeah. If the elections have been, and Joe Biden, as right now we're not going to speculate, but if we just freeze the moment and take it 40 days ahead, he's going to win. What would be your biggest advice for him in his speech? I'm not talking about ideas, but what should be in that speech?
I mean, when his acceptance speech?
Yes.
I think he has to. This is something I keep saying. That and
I guess it feels odd to write for a Democratic president, but
no. Say maybe to say this to a group in the Netherlands and to our friends around the world is this is a good moment to say that we want to encourage people to believe that the America that they trusted, to keep the peace, to protect it, that America, it was always there. And it got covered by dust and filth over the past few years, but underneath it's there. And we're going to blow off the dust, polish the brass, and make it gleam again. And that the country you believed in, it's waiting for you. And so I think that he can talk about that in a way that will touch so many different kinds of people, that the faith in the country that you may have lost, he's going to try to restore it.
I think that's an excellent note to end this conversation on. I want to thank you so much, David Frum, and I'd like to give the final word to Tracy Metz of the John Adams Institute.
Thank you. Also, on behalf of the John Adams, thank you so much for joining us, David Frum, with your insights and your very sharp mind and your view of history. I think that has really added a lot this evening. I wanted to mention to our readers some of our upcoming events. On October 6th, we'll be having a conversation with last year's Nobel Prize winner for economics, Abhijit Banerjee, about his research into solutions for poverty. October 20th, Susan Neiman, who's an American philosopher living in Berlin, about her book, Learning from the Germans, about how the US can learn from how the Germans dealt with their past in post-war years. And on November 4th, the day after the elections, we'll be having an event that we're calling The Day After, at which a number of speakers who've been at the John Adams previously will share in short blocks of 15 to 20 minutes their impressions of what happened the day before. Thank you for joining us. Sign up for our newsletter to keep abreast of what we're doing. These are exciting times, and there are a lot of exciting things going on at the John Adams Institute and at the Balie. Thank you, Tim, for this wonderful collaboration.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for watching. Watch the side of the Balie for our next programs. And lastly, again, I'd like to thank David Frum for talking to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.